Around 3 years ago, I made a video discussing Dragon Ball Super's often awful line art. While everyone else was complaining about the equally bad writing and the unfortunate animation issues caused by the terrible working conditions and time constraints for the show, I couldn't get past just how dreadful the line art for a large portion of the show looked. Unless you're making art that doesn't include line art at all, line art is the foundation of your work. Without strong line art, an entire illustration or frame of animation can collapse in on itself. For anyone who doesn't know, line art is the outline for characters and objects in a scene. It's what you have before you color or shade an image, and is what primarily makes up manga illustrations, outside of the screen tone dots that shade the images. Pretty straightforward. Line art is effectively the skeleton of your illustration. Some line art is thin, some is thick. This is known as the line weight of the line art, the thickness of a specific line. The heavier the line weight, the thicker it is. Line art can either have a static line weight or be dynamic. Dynamic line art sees individual lines changing thickness as they go, as well as different lines in the image being different thicknesses from each other. This allows you to do a multitude of things, from implying shape, implying shadows, showing the rigidity and weight of a surface or lack thereof, and much more. Line weight is an extremely powerful tool. All these years later, there's one part of that old Dragon Ball Super video that I think I glossed over too quickly, which I'd like to address today. Because man, sometimes I just really feel like I need to make a video about drawing, since I've spent over a decade seriously honing my craft, and I have no artist friends to talk about it with. Firstly, it's worth noting really quickly that Super's line art does improve later on in the show, once they get to the final arc. It gets a lot more dynamic, and much more of it is really clean, if you exclude all of the ugly digital effects they plaster all over everything. Seriously, Ultra Instinct would be beautiful if the aura wasn't an After Effects nightmare. But the dynamism of the line art is usually really great later on, and a few select scenes has some of the best animation in the series outside of the movies. But what if you don't want incredibly dynamic line weight? Are there benefits to using more static or completely static line weight, whether in animation or illustration? Well, one thing that I failed to really reflect on properly in that old video was the actual work that might go into dynamic line weight in animation specifically. I claimed at the time that I didn't really see a way that it could be more time-consuming than static line weight, but I completely failed to think of the workload increase in relation to back-to-back frames, instead only discussing the workload for individual frames. Dynamic line weight isn't more time-consuming to implement within individual frames, but particularly in hand-drawn or frame-by-frame animation, it can add a ton of time and work. After all, when animating, you don't necessarily want the lines to randomly change thickness with each frame, because that can make the art look messy, or like the characters and objects are bubbling or vibrating. Think of a show like Ed, Edd n Eddy, which intentionally makes its line art look like it's constantly in a state of flux, so that the show feels more lively and unique. Now imagine trying to remove that flux by making sure that each line is as similar in line weight as possible, when you have to draw each frame by hand while still making the line weight dynamic. It doesn't matter whether it's actually on animation cells or if you're doing it digitally. Replicating the exact same line nuances for the sometimes hundreds of frames that make up a single 5-second clip is a very tall order. It can certainly be done, but it would take a sharp eye and a truly masterful hand. I'd suspect this applies less to Flash-style tween animation, but I don't personally know. The days where every single show is hand-drawn, frame by frame, are long gone. The craft hasn't disappeared entirely, obviously, but today it's possible to animate using much more advanced versions of what we used to see with old Flash animations. Flash-style animation, in a sense, works more like animating a 3D object for a game or a CG movie. In the case of flash style animation, you have objects that make up a character, and then a skeletal rig that points out where the joints are on the objects, and the ability to pose keyframes that the program then tweens between. A tween is an in-between frame that sits between your important keyframe poses. Obviously, this style of animation is a lot more complicated than that these days, and I think a lot of people would be surprised at just how smooth you can make this type of 2D animation, relative to traditional frame-by-frame animation. Flash style animation really doesn't deserve its bad reputation these days. I don't know how much of Super is done with which animation techniques, but regardless, it utilizes dynamic line weight a lot later on, leading to a show that looks significantly better as it continues. It proves that they could have done better earlier had they been given the opportunity, but it's understandable that a lot of shows keep the dynamism of their line weight to a minimum, because doing otherwise can create a lot more strenuous work. As for illustrations, despite my love for dynamic line weight, there are definitely times where you'll want static or nearly static line weight instead. As should be immediately apparent, static line weight can strongly imply consistency in an object. So a rigid, square robot with a lot of corners could benefit from a consistent, thick outline, to imply that it has been precision designed and is using strong materials. You can also get an equally crisp Art Deco sort of look from consistently thick outlines, as you would see in a show like The Jetsons. It can make your art feel like it has more of a logo-style graphic design presentation, which can at times look extremely professional and sharp if you do it well. But this thick line art also limits the detail you can include in your illustrations. What if you don't want something that looks more like clip art, and instead still want your art to have flavor and life, and detail that can't easily be provided by thick, consistent line weight? Are there still benefits to static but thin line weight instead? Why, yes, of course there are. One thing that thin but mostly consistent line weight is incredibly good at is actually allowing for more line and shading detail. You can kind of think of illustration as a tug of war between different aspects of a drawing. The three main components you have access to are the line art, the color, and the shading, and I suppose in some art styles you could also throw in texture work. When you make certain decisions with one of these components, it might allow for more or less freedom with the others. Like I said just a moment ago, thicker line art can limit the amount of detail you can include within the line art itself, but it can also limit the amount of detail you can put in your shading, forcing your color to do a lot more work to create a cohesive image. Thinner line art, by contrast, allows your shading and your line art to be much more detailed without looking busy. Again, I'm someone who still really enjoys highly dynamic line weight, but there are also times where I feel like I can't quite extract the necessary detail out of it, and it limits how complex my shading can be. So recently, as you can see in the speed paint that has been in the background this entire time, I've been exploring thin line art that mimics a mechanical pencil rather than an ink brush. When working with a large canvas, this can allow for a lot of very small lines that still retain individuality and precision, but at the same time also make plenty of room for shading to do a lot more of the work. The way I traditionally do shading is almost more like a secondary way to add dimensionality to an existing illustration. The purpose it serves is more ancillary, with the line art itself being the main attraction. On the outside, it may seem like making lines just a few pixels thinner on average won't do much, but in practice it makes all the difference in allowing your line art and shading to breathe. It allows you to create more precise shapes with your shading, including really thin lines where rim lighting might hit a curved surface that would otherwise be completely in shadow with thicker line art, because you don't have the space to do anything else. Particularly when an object is taking up less of the canvas, or you need to fit more of an object in the canvas, or even when an object is far in the background, this can be crucial to maintaining the detail levels you might be looking for. Getting high detail from a character that is mostly or fully in frame can be difficult with thicker line art. But what's more, thin line art also allows you as an artist to include more lines that can more strongly represent the contours of an object without making it feel overwhelming to the viewer. Sometimes small creases in clothing or something like the lightest edge of a character's lips have to be shown through color and shading when using highly dynamic or thicker line art. Trying to show these shapes purely with the line art can feel ham-fisted with thicker lines, similar to what I discussed in the previous video related to Bulma's hair. Sometimes you've reached the maximum amount of line for an area in relation to your average line weight, and adding more lines can make lines crash, bleed together into a mush of conflicting shapes, and doesn't clearly delineate the shapes you're trying to show. It also doesn't let the negative space in between lines do as much work as it could. And that negative space is incredibly important. Most beginner artists greatly underestimate the value of not covering your entire canvas with stuff. Obviously, you're losing some stylization with the line art itself when it's universally thin. The thinner your average line is, the less dynamism you can employ in it, to the point where most people might not even notice any dynamism that is there. But depending on the type of image, your goals, and your art style, the extra space for detail that you're afforded might be much more beneficial. As I've grown as an artist over the 12-ish years or whatever since I started taking illustration seriously, I've learned just how many facets of various standard art styles are actually informed by technical limitations that the medium eventually had to evolve to work around. Yes, a lot of stylistic decisions artists make are certainly personal and subjective, but it has increasingly struck me over the years just how often a stylistic decision comes instead as an answer to a problem the artist was facing. Portraying the specific artistic idea you want to convey can be very difficult, and how you choose to work around problems can regularly be a very technical exercise of problem solving. These choices can become incredibly granular as well. Again, there are a billion different ways to draw a character's lips and mouth, for example. And yet many of them only work when you're using certain other techniques that complement their strengths, and don't conflict with their weaknesses. Just look at how rare it is in most anime for characters, even traditionally sexy female characters, to have real lips, specifically with the line art denoting the actual shape of said lips. At most, you might get some pink or red colors doing the job in the color of the image, but it's rare to see line art lips, which means in mini manga, where again, line art makes up 80 to 100% of the illustration a lot of the time, lips are straight up missing. Much of the time, there are no lips at all unless it's a profile view, where you can build them directly into the structure of the face's silhouette. This is often due to a lot of factors, some of which are down to the difficulty of drawing and animating such complex shapes. Surprise, surprise, the flexibility and malleable nature of lips makes them extremely difficult to draw and animate convincingly. People think hands are hard to draw, and they are, but lips can be just as, if not more, challenging, hence why they're so often simplified or entirely omitted. But sometimes they also just don't fit the structure of the rest of the face, the relative simplicity of the overall character design, or the type of line art you're using. You can obviously still find artists that use incredibly complex lips on their characters, because it works well with the way they build their other lines and shapes. Western comics tend to use lips much more often than manga, for example, because their characters are usually much more realistically detailed. And anyone my age who read gaming magazines in the late 90s and early 2000s might also remember artists like Ryan Kinnard, who illustrated a lot for the magazine PSM. His style sat in an interesting space between manga and Western superhero styling, as far as I can tell, with a huge emphasis on sex appeal, muscle detail, and pretty advanced gradiated shading. And yet most of the faces he drew were nearly featureless outside of the eyes and the lips. He regularly used very minuscule noses similar to a lot of manga, round facial structures to offer a lot of space, and eyes and lips that took up a large part of that surface. Characters drawn by Ryan Kinnard basically always have very, very pronounced lips, and his faces were structured to really take advantage of that design decision, because that was a large part of the sex appeal he was going for. Though my art doesn't really look much like his, there's still a pretty big influence under the surface of my work that comes directly from his work for PSM. Now, obviously, you certainly could put lips on characters in something like the Dragon Ball series without changing anything else. Nothing is stopping you from doing so. And putting the uncanny nature of it aside because we're so used to seeing them without lips, you could find artists and animators who could draw and animate them correctly so that they looked good on a technical level. But it's also abundantly clear that would be an insanely excessive amount of work for very little payoff given the rest of the way the character designs are laid out. Unlike Ryan's work, where lips are often integral to the designs, they wouldn't add anything to Toriyama's style. They wouldn't mesh well with the rest of the design decisions for the characters, and it would likely throw off the entire balance of the faces for most characters, who rely on very specific spacing between facial features to look good. You can kind of think of it like Sonic characters, whose hands and feet are so huge on their bodies that it severely limits the poses and animations that look good on them. I suppose Toriyama could certainly get away with it on his female characters, purely because our societal preconceptions about feminine features would make room for it in our heads. Women are supposed to have luscious lips or whatever, right? And at times, characters like Bulma will actually have very basic lips using just color in promotional art and such. But I also don't think more pronounced lips would look as good as what Toriyama's already done, without changing the art style in other ways to accommodate. Which is what I had to do with this illustration of her in the background. As you can tell by the title of the image, I intentionally tried to make Bulma with lips. In the sketching phase, these lips took the most time out of every other part of the illustration, because it was hard to make them look natural juxtaposed against her massive, simple eyes. I even had to completely alter the face shape and nose design to accommodate, to the point where you couldn't possibly say this is drawn in Toriyama's style. I myself have actually gotten a fair amount of confusion and criticism from people about my art style, because my characters often have much more detailed and pronounced noses than normal manga characters. It didn't start out that way, as you can see by these examples starting from around 2011 to present day. I'll let them run for a while. But my noses have become more nose-like as my art has progressed. Again, that's not to say many other manga styles don't have stronger noses, but that's not what we usually see, and not what we expect, particularly with characters that look like the ones I draw. The detail and strong facial features of something like JoJo characters are the exception in manga, not the rule. It doesn't represent what most people think of when you say the word manga. I took some inspiration from Disney animation styles and designs for my noses, because I was looking for facial features that had more three-dimensionality, definition, and detail that allowed them to stand out. Noses on real people can be all sorts of different shapes, and I wanted to represent that so that each character I created had a bit more of a distinct look. A lot of people don't really get it, but once I show them an example of one of those same drawings of those same characters with a more traditional manga-style non-nose, it often clicks. Suddenly, the face looks completely out of whack without my noses in place. But accommodating for these more complex noses, and later when I started to accommodate for the option to include lips when I felt it was necessary, required readjusting other facial features. Initially, when I started crafting my own art style, the characters had the enormous eyes we've come to expect from manga and very sharp but simple features. They had simple mouths, simple noses, large but flat-looking faces, and simple, stylized hair. And that's not a bad thing. But once I started looking for ways to pull less exaggerated, less cartoony expressions from them, it kind of fell apart. It was difficult to make a female character cry in a way that looked, ugly and agonizing, rather than just like a sad but innocent little schoolgirl, or a cartoon comically wailing to the heavens. It was difficult to make a character look genuinely furious, or like they were literally dying from laughter, because with such simple facial features and so few lines, exaggerations had to come from making things bigger and more comical, usually even more simple, rather than adding detail. Adding detail to these character designs instead made them look kind of like those highly detailed paintings you'd see for gags in shows like Ren and Stimpy or SpongeBob. They looked out of place, and it only made the image feel more like something you couldn't take seriously because the contrast between the detail levels was so sharp. It didn't look like that character anymore, it almost looked like a caricature. Obviously, part of that came from a lack of experience at the time. As I got better, I found techniques that bridged the gap, but I've still stuck with retaining more detail and continuing to try and push it, largely because I like the options it gives me. I usually have bigger noses that are more detailed, smaller mouths but that are also more detailed, and smaller eyes that are again more detailed. The face has proportions that are more similar to a real person, though obviously still exaggerated. But I've also increasingly found that in order to do it this way, I have to use thinner and thinner line art to make it work. Again, just those few extra pixels of width in each line across the line art can make a huge difference in how much perceivable space you have on a character before things get too busy. And as an illustrator, you really do often see a lot of this stuff from a distinctly more technical, objective perspective in a sense, than the other people viewing your work from the outside. Choices are often made for purposes that are equally as practical as they are quote-unquote artistic. Compromise is the name of the game a lot of the time, even with as free as we are to illustrate whatever we want, however we want these days. But I like that. It allows me to think outside of the box when trying something new, because oftentimes the problem isn't that you aren't good enough or that you don't have the right tool. Instead, it can simply be that you aren't making proper room for a tool or technique you could be using instead. But what do you guys think? Do you have any preferences for different types of line art? Do you even care about art style at all? And what consistent choices have you seen made in specific art styles that you think might have come from a place of practicality and technique instead of preference? Also, let me know if you're interested in seeing more illustration-centric videos, because I wouldn't mind making more on occasion, if people want to see them. Anyway, sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.